Our next presenter is Roxanne Panchesi. Excuse me. She is an associate professor at Simon Fraser University. She's the author of her book, the first book, Future Tense, the Culture of Anticipation in France Between the Wars. It came out from Cornell University Press in 2009. A very interesting study of how the future and fantasies about the future inflect and act as a force in the past. She's currently, what she'll present on today, is part of a new research project that is funded by the SSHRC, a cultural political history of French atomic program and nuclear weapons. She hosts a new book in French studies, a monthly podcast that you can find under the New Book Network. So please join me in welcoming our next presenter. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ben, for that introduction, and to Andal as well for organizing the panel. On February 14th, 2014, the popular French daily Le Parisien published Le Document Choc sur la bombe A en Algérie, an article by Sébastien Ramnou that revisited the first French atomic test in the Sahara on February 13th, 1960. The article included an image of a 54-year-old military map, a French military map, declassified only recently. Depicting radioactive fallout in the region surrounding the test center at Regan, the map revealed the military's awareness at the time of levels of exposure exceeding the norms of the period, and these were much lower than our current standards, and covering an area much larger than French officials have admitted to since 1960, and this extended into parts of southern Europe, so the map was quite controversial. The map and accompanying article in Le Parisien could serve as the basis for a number of different conversations about the history and legacies of the French nuclear testing program that began in Algeria and continued with some interruptions until the last controversial set of tests in the Pacific in the mid-1990s. Most important from a contemporary perspective is the way this evidence implicates France in the knowing exposure of military personnel and civilians to radiation. Proof of this awareness of the test's risks and impact has been vital to the cause of victims seeking recognition and financial compensation. Respecting the importance of the test's effects and the needs for forms of restitution, I want to pursue a different historical line of inquiry today, rather than a current legal or ethical one. My focus here is on a set of ideas and questions that the title of Ramnou's exposé raises for me. To begin with, I would argue that the shock of the article depends on what some scholars have termed an Algeria syndrome, including the revelation over the past 2 decades and more of numerous documents and previously disavowed military acts in Algeria and France in the 1950s and early 1960s. And I should say that the article, like many others like it, doesn't mention the war at all. In 2014, the exposure of truths about nuclear testing is necessarily inflected with the politics of memory and forgetting of la guerre sans nom. Shocking in its own right, certainly, the exposure of military personnel and civilians to radiation during what was not then recognized by France as an Algerian war adds yet another layer to the French struggle to come to terms with the imperial past and its injustices, and perhaps the most deplorable of these being acts of torture and murder committed during the armed struggle for Algerian independence. Ramnou's title expresses the complexities of history and memory in other ways as well, albeit unintentionally. For Le Parisien and its contemporary readers, there might not at first seem to be any trouble with referring to the French testing site in the Sahara as Algeria, or the explosive detonated there in 1960 as a bomb. And yet, during the period leading up to and following the explosion of Gerboise Bleu, the name of the first French atomic device tested, and there was Bleu, Blanc, Rouge, and then Verte, from early 1960 on, this set of identifications was very much in dispute at the time. Launched only 20 years after the German invasion of France during the Second World War, the program of French atomic weapons experimentation that began in 1960 was inextricably linked to the legacies of wartime defeat and occupation and to empire. Nevertheless, there has been a tendency in broad narratives of the post-war period to suggest a disjuncture between the, quote, radiance of France, and of course I'm borrowing from Gabriel Hecht here, as a modern nation seeking grandeur through nuclear and other technologies, and the radiance of French imperialism. Indeed, historians frequently segregate the two projects, characterizing civilian nuclear successes as compensation for the post-war loss of empire, and the development of an atomic weapons program in particular as a harbinger of France's future power, so distinct from the imperial project. Histories of French colonialism in Algeria and the war of decolonization itself, in particular, typically spend little, if any, time on the nuclear testing in the region that took place in the early 1960s. Segregating the history of nuclear weapons testing in the Sahara from the history of the Algerian War and its aftermath, this scholarship is missing an opportunity to push further against some of the very disavowals it has challenged in recent decades. The French refusal to come to terms with the Algerian War of decolonization as a war rather than a domestic conflict, silences regarding French violations of Algerian and African sovereignties and territories, and the suppression of truths about state and military acts in the region, including atrocities committed against civilian populations. A pillar of post-war defense policy and the national self-representation of an autonomous France able to hold its own in the nuclear age, the atomic project was, from its very inception, imbricated with the history of empire and decolonization. As the French media, and this is print, radio, and television, reported the preparations for and successful execution of the initial Saharan test in February 1960, stories of rebellion, unrest, and insurgency in Algeria appeared every day. Treated as parallel in time, but distinct in terms of their political and military meanings, these storylines were not entirely disconnected, however. In both the French and imperial and nuclear projects, the definitions of territory, sovereignty, bombs, and even war itself were the subject of intense debate during this critical historical moment. In The Invention of Decolonization, Todd Shepard has pointed out that very soon after 1954, the Algerian Revolution became an international symbol of resistance to imperialism in its dominant bourgeois variant. Despite the argument from Paris that this was a domestic problem, the FLN succeeded in internationalizing the conflict. And of course, one of the key sites of this internationalization was the United Nations. What historians haven't really explored is how the French project to test nuclear devices in the Sahara may have contributed indirectly to that internationalization. This relationship between France's atomic aims and the crisis of imperialism in Algeria was no more evident than in the international dispute involving France and a number of African and Asian countries that took place at the UN on the eve of the first French atomic test. On August 13, 1959, the Moroccan delegation asked the General Assembly of the UN to consider the question of French nuclear tests in the Sahara, quote, in view of the anxiety of its population in the area. Treated as distinct from the Algerian question that was also on the UN's agenda at the time, the issue of nuclear testing was a focus of discussion at 11 meetings of the First Committee on Disarmament and International Security in early November 1959. Several, and eventually more than 22 countries, and I won't read the whole list, but it included Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Ghana, Guinea, India, well, I am reading the whole list, Morocco, Tunisia, the United Arab Republic, Yemen, and then Japan and the Federation of Malaya joined. So that's almost 22. They submitted a draft resolution essentially requesting that France not proceed with its proposed test in the Sahara. After much discussion, the General Assembly of the UN passed an amended version of this resolution, this original 22-power resolution as it was called. And I'll just quote from it here. This is just a bit of it, recognizing the anxiety caused by the contemplated tests in the Sahara among all people, and particularly those of Africa, expressing its grave concern over the intention of the government of France to conduct nuclear tests, the UN requests that France refrain from conducting such tests. Throughout the debate, the issue of the Sahara as a contested territory played a central role. Was the Saharan testing ground and surrounding region French? Was it Algerian? Was it African? Significantly or insignificantly populated by inhabitants with the right to be consulted about France's military intentions in the area? In insisting upon exploding its atomic bomb in the Sahara, France is trespassing legal boundaries, declared the delegate for Yemen in 1959. This test and what remains of the colonial influence in Africa cannot be dissociated from one another, claimed the delegate from the United Arab Republic. We would like to see the French Marianne with a cape of liberty and equality and not with the atomic mushroom. The Sahara does not belong to France, insisted the representative from Ghana. Despite protests from the French delegate Jules Moch that the question of the allegiance of the Sahara was not on the agenda, and the session chairman's reminders that the issue of the Sahara, quote, was connected more with the Algerian question, which will be dealt with at a later stage, the 1959 United Nations debate over nuclear testing returned again and again to the issue of imperialism and the claims of not just Algerians, but of Africans and Asians more broadly, to territorial and other forms of sovereignty that had been historically, were currently, and remained likely to be in the future violated by France. Far from deserted, the Sahara was a territory belonging to Africa and Africans, and nuclear testing there would constitute a betrayal of the people of the region who had not been consulted as to whether they approve of a bomb being dropped on their territory. The French refusal of the Sahara as Algeria was bound up with an investment in the region that included military installations, nuclear and non, and importantly, the oil that many French people saw as the key to their economic future. This made the status of the territory a vital concern for both the French, who argued that the Great Desert had only been pacified and developed thanks to French effort and investment and could never be ceded, and the Algerians, who maintained that the Sahara was an integral and inalienable part of their homeland. Even into the negotiations of the Evian Accords in 1961, Louis Joxe, the French Minister for Algerian Affairs, contended that the Sahara was not realistically or historically part of Algeria. But just as arguments for an Algérie française gave way to the invention of decolonization, so too did France under de Gaulle eventually abandon pretensions that the Sahara must be treated as an entity separate from Algeria by the end of 1961. In the 1959 UN debates about the matter, Mock did not use the word bomb once. Explosion, test, experiment, device, but never bomb, insisting that the nuclear tests in the Sahara, the allegiance of the Sahara, and Algeria were all separate agenda items. The French delegate also maintained that the devices being tested in the region were harmless scientific experiments, presenting no risk, either local or general. The tests would, in fact, be safer than those conducted previously by the three existing nuclear powers in 1959, so the US, the Soviet Union, and the UK. And while delegates opposed to France's tests claimed the Republic's entry into the Club Atomique was an attempt to transform military power into political power, President de Gaulle himself had insisted that, in truth, France, in equipping herself with a nuclear weapon, will render a service to world equilibrium. Mock's refusal to use the B word was a reflection of this broader project to represent France as a champion of disarmament and peace on the world stage. Expressing his dismay with those speakers carried away by their own eloquence, who confused the consequences of a bomb dropped in wartime with those of a peacetime test, the French delegate deployed the technical and the scientific to downplay and even refuse tests as military and political acts. Yes, bombs dropped on a population center during an atomic war would destroy life over thousands of kilometers, he explained. But a test in peacetime on a restricted desert proving ground bears no resemblance to a military bombardment. The desert was not sovereign. France would be conducting scientific experiments, not dropping bombs. There was no war going on in the region in 1959. Everything is ready for the French atomic explosion, proclaimed a headline in Le Figaro, reporting on the upcoming weekend of February 13th and 14th, 1960. Below an article offering the French public information on the Saharan test site at Regan and the technical aspects of this historical detonation of a national bomb, Le Figaro reproduced a disturbing image. Under the heading, Propaganda in Morocco, appeared a drawing of two children, a girl and boy, huddled together, surrounded by a mushroom cloud. Hiroshima en Afrique, read the caption. According to Le Figaro, the image had appeared originally in a Moroccan Union publication, noting that similar images could be found plastered on the walls of Casablanca and Rabat. Le Figaro demanded, how can one dare compare to Hiroshima, a nuclear test conducted in the middle of the desert in which all scientific precautions have been taken to avoid danger? I linger on this image reproduced in the French press just before the detonation of the first atomic, I'm going to say bomb, because it so clearly emblematizes the tensions within the historical struggle over the definitions of territory, military weapons and acts, and war itself. Equating the French nuclear test with the dropping of a bomb on innocent civilians, and the boy and the girl, I was going to show you an image, but I can't, but there's in Arabic, over the image of the boy and the girl, there's an Arabic inscription that says, "Your children are in peril." So this all underlined this notion. The image expressed the anti-imperialist position of those who had voiced their opposition to French plans at the United Nations in 1959. The French detonation would be much more than a nuclear experiment. It would be Hiroshima, an act of war perpetrated not in the desert, the Sahara, or even Algeria, but in an Africa with a long history of colonial invasion, occupation, and oppression by the French. An Africa that would have its sovereignty and safety once again violated by Western imperialism. And the notion of the tests as militarily aggressive acts was not just the rhetorical domain of the voices of anti-imperialism at this time. The idea that a French bomb, such as those devices being tested in the desert, could be used in the suppression of Algerian resistance was also articulated by the most radical proponents of a French Algeria into the early 1960s. It was none other than General Chal who, during the military rebellion of 1961, suggested to the head of the French Special Weapons Command, refrain from detonating your little bomb. Keep it, it will always be useful to us. The devices were bombs after all, and from more than one perspective, France was at war. So when did the Algerian War begin? When did it end? 1954 to 62 are the dates we work with for the most part today. But the end of the Algerian War was also, in some sense, the moment of its inception as a historical and political event recognized and defined for both France and an emergent Algeria. As Benjamin Stora has noted, the war was acknowledged only at the moment when the treaty marking its end was signed, the Evian Accords of 1962. And as we know, this ending, that was also a beginning, has had an extremely complex history of memory and forgetting since 1962. But to stick to my concerns here today, the end of the Algerian War depends on a particular definition of war and military aggression, one that Hiroshima en Afrique challenged in a variety of ways. The Evian Accords that ended the war also guaranteed the continuation of France's military presence, including atomic testing, in what would hitherto be understood as an independent Algeria for a further 5 years. But the question of sovereignty did not cease to be an issue after independence, what I would call a kind of leaky independence, for Algerians in particular and for Africans more broadly. 3 years after the Afro-Asian Front, and this is how people referred to it at the time, at the UN denounced French nuclear testing as acts of war, the dropping of bombs on a sovereign territory with an innocent civilian population that needed to be protected, Ahmed Ben Bella, the first president of the new Algerian Republic, announced that Algeria could not permit further French atomic tests in the Sahara. And when, less than 1 year later, during the anniversary month of the signing of the Evian Accords, France conducted another nuclear test in the Sahara, Ben Bella called for the revision of those same accords. After 1963, the French conducted several more underground tests in the Sahara. By July 1st, 1967, all French facilities were evacuated to the South Pacific, where the story of the imbrication of the nuclear and imperial entered another, no less complicated phase. Thanks.